It was a useful thing.
Sorry.
That's
Sorry, I
fine.
forgot. There we go.
Got it. I don't know, I'll try to keep to some reasonable time because I would really like for you to be able to hear from Rep. Garbely and to ask questions. And I think that Maura and Rep. Garbely can add invaluable texture and understanding to how this all came to be, and also can correct me if part of my story is wrong here. But I put together some slides. I hope you'll bear with me on this somewhat professorial approach to things, but I think it'll help organize stuff. And I'll try to move through those for about 15 minutes or so. And then open things up, and I would love to answer questions and hear everybody's thoughts. But with that, let me just I'm going to do a quick screen share here. Can everybody see this okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay. And I'm going to go to slideshow. There we go. Cool. So, as Maura said, what this legislation is about is the creation of a special commission on state institutions in Massachusetts. And for those of you who don't know this kind of story, Massachusetts once had a large number of two types of institutions, largely speaking: state schools and state hospitals. The state schools were for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the state hospitals were basically asylums. And at one point, there were 27 of these or more all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. With tens of thousands of inmates. I'm happy to describe why I use the word inmate later if you have questions about that. Hundreds of thousands of employees over the decades, and therefore millions of people whose family stories are touched by these places. The institutional network in Massachusetts of state schools and hospitals was pioneering in its day, and basically anywhere else in the world that you see the legacy of these institutions, it's often the case that Massachusetts had a hand in developing that network. At the core of that are two institutions in Waltham: the Walter E. Fernald Developmental Center, which began in Massachusetts in 1848 as the Massachusetts Experimental School for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Youth. It was one class, 13 kids. Radical belief that kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities could be educated, deserved a public education for free, and should have that right and be able to go home and work or do things for their lives. That obviously morphed into a large network of institutions that permanently housed people for life, and many of you probably know the stories of those are not so good at a lot of points. The Met State, if Fernald was the first of the state schools, the Met State was the last of the state asylums built. It was a massive asylum on the edge of Waltham, Lexington, and Belmont. And it was opened around 1930. All of these were closed in succession over the 1990s into the 2000s and 10s. I came into this largely speaking around the cemetery that these two institutions shared. The cemetery is called the Met Fern Cemetery, and these are the grave markers there, which are simply a C and a number or a P and a number for Catholic or Protestant. 296 inmates were buried there because their families were not notified or did not know, or in some way were unable to claim their loved ones' bodies. And I felt that this was a real profound injustice. As a disabled person, as someone who's steeped in this history, I thought this was really wrong and needed to be addressed. And I had the chance over the years to work with students at Gann Academy, a private high school in Waltham, to kind of start digging into this history, get the names of the people here, and learn the landscape of why it is that we have this sort of secret history of these places we don't ever talk about. Why is that important? In large part because I don't think this is really past, the old saying that the past is not really past. This matters for people who are alive. Patricia on the right here is a survivor of the Fernald School. She grew up there in the 1950s and 60s. She's in her 70s now, though she looks like she's about 50, and she's learning how to read. She just got married. She lives with the legacy of all of this and has always wanted to tell her story. As she said to me, The state boys always got to tell their story. The state girls rarely did, and she was one of the state girls. On the bottom left, Michael Scott is at the grave of his uncle, John, who died at the Fernald School and was buried, and his family never knew where he was buried. We found that his grave was in the Metfern Cemetery, found Michael's father, and were able to hold a memorial service. A cello player in the background is an autistic cello player from Berkeley. Try to do restorative justice around these places. The knees that you see above are a profound reminder to me. That's a friend of mine, George. If you zoom all the way in on them, what you'll see are cut marks all across his knees from having been crucified as a child on a bed frame at the Fernald School, forced to kneel for hours on a metal bed frame. So what we're talking about is history, but we're also talking about human rights that's very much alive today. Working with my students, we decided to create a museum exhibit and around the history of disability. And at the opening of that museum, we were made a promise by the mayor of Waltham that we would be able to use the Fernald site for a major museum on the history of these institutions. But instead, that didn't come to pass. And while this says visitors per week, this is actually break-ins at the former Fernald site, which is a site of major historical significance. And you can see by week, hundreds of people breaking into the institution and destroying it bit by bit. And it became very clear that the promise of actually using the site for some constructive forward-going historical memorialization was not a priority for the city. What does that look like in descriptive detail? Those of you who remember the heated pool at the Fernald can see on the right what happened to it. It was left to rot and fall apart. On the left, you can see a pornography shoot being taken in the library of the Fernald, which was once the largest single library on the history of developmental and intellectual developmental disabilities in the world, now used for something like this. The city doing nothing to stop it, and instead deciding to turn the site into a giant party location. They turned it into a drive-through holiday light show, as did many of the other sites around the state where there were institutions a few years ago. People like Patricia have said to me that they believe that there are bodies buried all over these sites that need investigation. People like Patricia were never believed because they have intellectual disabilities. And I choose to believe them until proven otherwise. And I felt, as did a number of other advocates around the state, that this was a real affront to use this site for a drive-through holiday light show, especially given the lack of action on memorialization. So we did good old-fashioned protest. Large number of advocacy organizations around the state got involved, including the ARC, and said to the city, this is wrong. This needs to change. It needs to stop. You can't do things like this at a site like this. 2,500 people signed a petition. We got international media attention on this. The Globe picked it up, CBS News around the world, the Associated Press, and we protested. And we met with a lot of backlash. That protest came to an end in December of 2019, when in the middle of our protest, as we were gaining kind of energy and momentum, and it looked like there was going to be a substantial push to end this thing, suspiciously a building caught fire at the Fernald, and I was told that at least one major senior city official was going to try to pin this on the protesters and have us arrested for arson. At that point, I decided, along with other organizers, that we should find a different way to protest this, that this was simply devolving into something that was like, I don't know, an old school like Dennis Lehane style novel, and didn't need to be. But there were some takeaways that came from all of this. The story of these places is largely unknown and it's being lost. The people associated with these places are not empowered to be heard, and their stories are being lost. Without knowing this history, people engage in this amazing exceptionalism about these sites, which resemble very much places like the Magdalen Laundries in Ireland or the Canadian Catholic residential schools. But we don't believe we're the kinds of people who ever would have those things in our own backyard. Disabled people have always been prevented from leading this work to look into this history. And we decided that there were too many problems at the municipal level to really be able to take this on, which leads to legislation. Senator Mike Barrett worked at the Fernald in college, was left traumatized by that experience, I think I can fairly say. And he said, look, it sounds like there needs to be a way to not just address the issues that exist around these sites, which needs to be done. There's nowhere to go to just find the story of the state institutions on the state's website. There's nowhere to go to find the names of these people in these anonymous graves. There's no central kind of organization to all this, but also there's no pathway to say, this is what we're going to do with this knowledge. What are we going to do with it? Do we need museums? Do we need education? Do we need it in the public school curriculum? Senator Barrett said, what if we were to create a commission that would look into this sort of thing? Could you draft some kind of language around this, knowing the issues? And I said tentatively, yes. We went to Representative Garbely and said, does this sound like a wise idea? And he said, yes. And we drafted this legislation and put it forward in both the Senate and the House to create a commission. What's unique about this is sort of in its opening language. This is the main text of the commission bill as it took shape over time. There shall be a special commission to study and report on the history of state institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities or mental health conditions in the Commonwealth. And this commission will review existing records that the state has, examine the availability or barriers of access, which are huge for people, huge barriers to accessing records, assess and compile the burial locations of residents who died in the care of the state, determine the likelihood and possible locations of unmarked graves at these sites, and design a framework for public recognition of this history overall. There is a second clause in here, which looks like a long list of names and organizations who have members on something like this, but it boils down to the most sort of revolutionary part of the legislation, which is that this commission will be chaired by and a majority membership of people with disabilities. Disabled people will lead this work. Disabled people will be the majority of the membership of this commission. That has never been done anywhere in the world. Question was, could we get this passed? And that took a substantial amount of organizing. We created a massive coalition, thank you, Maura, around this, involving a couple dozen of the state's largest historic, disability, take your pick, advocacy organizations who agreed to jump into this fight and to try to help ensure that this would get passed. There was opposition. Many of you have heard these things. If you've heard about the battles over institutionalization or deinstitutionalization, it wasn't that bad. You often hear that because there was a very big reform era that never got a lot of attention. There's something that I've taken to calling disability ventriloquism, where former caretakers occasionally feel that they can say, well, the person I took care of would have felt this way, which I find to be really offensive. The belief that disabled people can't do this work. There are some advocacy groups in the state who really believe that we're not capable of this stuff. And many people saying that the past is really past. Let it go, let it be. And some of them made really inappropriate demands. Promise us seats so that we don't fight you, or promise to tell certain stories in a certain way instead of making this true historical work. We dealt with those concerns in various ways, often by doing large-scale public advocacy, public talks by self-advocates, many of whom were survivors of the institutions. We got major media attention for these things. We were able to draw people's attention to this and educate them on it. And that really led to a very positive response from legislators. They understood it was bad through most of the history of these places. Disabled people can speak for ourselves. We can do the work. The past matters now, they got that. And there was an openness to making substantive changes with us to try to make this bill work. But I think this led to a quiet issue that we didn't expect, which was once it seemed more plausible and it really was clear that there's significant weight, human rights weight to this, I think that some people at the state level began to get skittish about what will this all mean then, if this thing is created. And if you'll forgive a painful civics lesson, I'll show you how that happens in kind of real time. Bills are introduced in either chamber or both in the legislature. We introduced this in both, Rep. Garbally in the House, Senator Barrett in the Senate. And they are sent to an initial committee to review them. And that committee kind of vets everything from the start. In this case, it was the Joint Committee on Mental Health, Substance Abuse, and Recovery. We met with them a ton. They have options. They can send a bill to study, which really means they're going to kill it. They can vote it down outright, also kills it. Or they can give it a favorable reporting out, which means it kind of goes up a pyramid to the next most important committee, which reviews it again. That'd be Ways and Means or Healthcare Financing. And if it gets through that, it gets all the way to the end. And it goes to the full chamber for a vote, gets reconciled by the two houses and sent to the governor. That all had to happen by July 31st. We introduced this 2 years ago at the start of the session. We began to get concerned that unlike the green light we got into the committee, that we were getting yellow lights slowing things down on getting out of committee. Kept meeting with them, same questions came up, tried to meet with the chairs in person. Chairs repeatedly would not meet with us. We began to get concerned that there may be opposition to this. And that bore out that there was, it seems to be some substantial opposition on the executive side of the state government.
Alex,
So
I'm gonna interrupt you for 1 second. I just wanted to say back on that slide that after it went to the Joint Committee on Mental Health, Substance Abuse, and Recovery, we had an amazing hearing and brought in so many individuals that spoke about the need for this. I thought that it just was the most powerful of testimony from a coalition that I had seen at a hearing. So they had that to think about. And I would add one of the hardest parts during this process was the lack of communication. I mean, and this happens a lot in the process of legislation, but Alex had said this has been, since the beginning of the session, which is, over 18 months ago. And I think that was the most frustrating to not hear. And, luckily we had our sponsors doing a lot to dig for us and to keep pushing. But from an advocacy perspective, I think that was one of the hardest. But I will say that hearing was just mind-blowing. So good. That hearing was spectacular. I agree. And I also thank you for mentioning the frustration around the silence. For someone with a mental health condition, it's really hard for me. It's really, really hard to not hear it. Without partners like Maura or Rep. Garbally or Senator Barrett's office, it's really, really hard to not hear back and to not get suspicious and anxious and have it really taken it. Has a bad impact on my own mental health. I think it has a bad impact on other self-advocates in the community as well. And it's exactly why we needed each other, I think, to get through all of this. And it led to a kind of novel solution. There's a way around that whole process. You can throw something in the state budget. It's a really risky thing to do. Doesn't often succeed, but this needed some funding anyway. And so Senator Barrett proposed the idea of instead making an amendment to the state budget, pulling this out of committee and around them. And then it goes straight to the Senate Committee on Ways and Means. And they took this up and debated it. Again, they have the option to kill it outright. But there was significant coalitional advocacy around this. And a really crucial moment I heard about in the Senate chamber where there was a debate about whether disabled people could actually be the co-chairs of this commission, where Senator Barrett stood up and said it would be better to simply not have the legislation proceed at all than to have a situation in which disabled people aren't leading this work. And I think that stand, that's a substantial stand to take. And that really swayed everybody on the committee to move forward with this. I think it gave it energy and was a catalyst, and it worked. It got out of the Senate.
which left a huge lift for Rep. Garbally on the House side, which is you have to then get everyone on that side to say, this is a good thing for us to do and we should support this and it should go through when we put these things together. So I know from other reps out there, the large coalition that the representative put together around that, which succeeded. And this went to the governor and it passed. And we have a special commission on state institutions that will be formed. I've heard from scholars around the world, this is unprecedented in its structure and design. It begs questions, what's next? Many of us, myself included, have never set up a commission before. There need to be members appointed, all kinds of things. And just for your own kind of informational baseline on that, I think I think this will take a little time, because there's going to be a change in administration. And I've seen that the governor has deferred a number of other related things, saying that really should go to the next administration. Similarly, there may be a new head of DDS or a new head of DMH. They have to appoint the co-chairs. Given all that shifts, I think the appointments to the commission and setting it up probably won't happen until the new year. I could be wrong about that, but that's my sense. I personally feel it needs geographic diversity. These places were all over the state. It needs actual diversity, BIPOC diversity on it. It needs disability diversity on it. People representing many different walks of life. I think we could do something really inclusive and communal. I'm not sure it's about holding the seats. I don't need to hold a seat on something like this. I do want to do the work. And I feel like there are a lot of people who feel that way, that they want to support this. And for that to happen, there remains one last major advocacy initiative that would really help, which is, currently speaking, in Massachusetts, all records from these institutions are sealed in perpetuity. If you ever get to look at one, it will look like what you see on your screen, the names of individuals blacked out. There are two problems with this. It means that crowdsourcing this work, students who want to do this, disabled folks out in the community, is impossible because the state will not give you the records to review. It also means that if the commission is able to locate the names of all the people buried in unmarked graves around the state, they will not be able to release those names. They will have to release a blacked out list, which somewhat defeats the purpose of our work at hand. There is a bill in the legislature that advanced to the committees on Ways and Means. Its number is up here, called Access to Public Records. It will open records that are 90 years old or older. It has the support of disability legal groups who feel that that strikes a balance between right to privacy and historic records. It would not apply to someone who's still alive, but it would begin to open up all of these records. And this is really the root administrative reason why we don't know this history or talk about it, is that these records are not easily accessible to historians or to advocates or to family members. Does this do everything? No, it's inadequate, but it's a start that would open up about half of the history of the state institutions and asylums and allow for, I think, the way disabled folks lead, which is we could do a community effort around something like this that would be something really special. But for that to happen at this point in the legislative session, the legislature will need to take it up in what's called the informal session. And that's very hard to do. And it requires unanimous consent in the legislature for them to vote on it. I think it can stand a chance, but it needs help from folks who are willing to call their legislators and say, hey, can you reach out to the chair of Ways and Means and say, I think this deserves a vote in informal session, and really go to the line for it. So I've probably talked for a long time, longer than I expected to. That is the kind of crux of the legislation. I will pipe down now and take any questions that you have, open it up to Rep. Garbally and Maura to add things in. And I just want to thank you all for being here to kind of hear about this story for the first time and the first pass at kind of telling it. So.
Alex, thank you so much. That was an amazing summary, fitting in absolutely everything. And it was like a little walk down memory lane of the last couple of years. So a little bit of a roller coaster down memory lane, I guess. But yeah, thank you. So wonderful. The other thing I just wanted to mention, the only thing was, that we in years past would have really struggled with getting funding added to this line item in the budget or added to the amendment. And maybe it had something to do with the financial situation and the revenue this year, but we're really lucky to see this as a funded special commission, whereas there's a lot of commissions that get through, they don't have funding, just doesn't make them quite as substantial. So that was really wonderful to see too.
That's right.
Yeah, so I don't know, Rep. Garbely, did you want to jump in anywhere? I'd love to give you some time to talk about this.
Well, I just come to listen to Alex, because whenever
Yeah.
he speaks on a
He's
panel,
incredible.
I learned something. So it's just great to be here with all of you. I loved how we started with the passing of the commission, and then Alex ended with a bill we're trying to get passed on public record, right? We're never done. We're always trying to pass legislation and move on to the next one. And I just saw Angela Ortiz, I see, is working hard on another very, very important, critical bill to our community and to our state. When I got involved, I had talked to you, Maura, and Charlie, and I talked to Alex and really learned from Alex the history of our state institutions, and more importantly, the individuals who lived in our state institutions. And I took a walk and saw many of those unmarked graves, right? The graves that have a P and a C, and, from Boston to the western part of the state, these graves exist. And within those graves are the stories of the individuals who are buried there that nobody has ever heard, right? Everyone on this call has a story, right? And we can share that story. That story can be read, sometimes for good or for worse, but that story can be read, right? These individuals, we don't know their story. They've never been told. How dehumanizing is that? It's unconscionable, which is why I made this a priority this session. It's rare for a bill to pass the first time it's been filed, but I attribute that to Alex and the advocates and the ARC, all those who testified before the Mental Health Committee and shared their stories, why this is so important, going into really heart-wrenching detail on why this bill was critical. And for us to be able to do our work, or for the commission to be able to do that work, the important work, it really does need the records bill to get passed as soon as possible to make it just a little easier. We're fortunate where Alex and his class have done so much work in uncovering a lot of these stories, but the hurdle that could be alleviated or lifted from the passage of the records bill would just make it all a lot, I don't want to use the word easier, but it would help the research that can get done by the commission a lot more fruitful, right? And we can learn things, we can learn the stories and give voices to the voiceless, which is why we filed this bill to begin with. So, we're excited it's signed into law. We hope we can celebrate with the governor at some point, in the near future. But for right now, we'll kind of celebrate our success and figure out how to make sure this commission is diversified and represents all the communities that it's critical that it does represent, and figure out how we can make sure this commission is successful by not just passing the records bill, but making sure we stay on top of it, because commissions sometimes have a history of running off the track. So we really need to be focused and make sure the commission is on track of what we wanted to do. And, the fact that we were able to get it funded is really rare for a commission. So that is really exciting. And to me, make sure that we can get a lot of great work done. So thank you very much, Maura, and thank you, Alex.
Absolutely. I am so grateful. I just want to open it up to questions from anybody who's joined us. And I know Alex probably has to leave in a little bit. So if you have some questions for him, go ahead and unmute, just ask. in case people didn't see it, Rep. Garbally is the sponsor for the records bill as well. So you can follow up with him. You can follow up with Alex or I about, you know, how to need to get a fact sheet and advocate with your legislator for that bill.
I guess I had a question. I guess sort of a process question. I was thinking about how, you know, you started with the legislative process, and when you ran into the snag there, you switched over to the budget. And I guess I'm wondering in terms of, I mean, is it because you were having trouble with the legislative process that it worked in the budget? Or if you had started with the budget, I mean, what's the difference? Are you dealing with the same people or different arguments, or how does that work? I mean, no.
Want me to take this?
Yeah.
So I think you know this better than anybody because of all your great legislative work. But, you know, when we file bills in the beginning of January of the 2-year session, you can have 7,000 bills get filed by members of the House and the Senate. And from there, the clerk takes all the bill. You know this, but I'm just for the other folks on the call. The clerks take the bills, that he puts a number on them. The Senate does the same thing, and they go off to their various committees where they have a hearing, and then the committee makes a recommendation. You know, the goal of legislators is to try to get that bill passed, whether it's as a standalone bill or in any vehicle that's moving. And I'm very confident that we would have gotten this bill passed as a standalone bill. I think we were very close to having that happen. But the budget came first, and we just decided to attach it to the budget because that was the vehicle moving. And thankfully it got signed into law. And it doesn't matter, you know, whether it was a standalone bill or passing the law, as long as it's passed both branches and have Governor Baker's signature on it. It is law, and it means just the same as it would if it was a standalone bill.
Great
And
question.
I think there was from my standpoint on the outside, and as I alluded to before, this can be really hard. Like, and I know again that you know this stuff well, but it just it wasn't entirely clear what was going on, like why it was moving slowly, and you know. I can make a lot of assumptions about that, and that's where my mental health is not always a good friend to me. And I think you can't necessarily know what it is. Like we had some inkling that there was some opposition to it, but what wasn't really entirely clear. There was a lot around mental health in front of that committee this session, right? They had this huge omnibus bill they were trying to pass. It just wasn't clear, and it seemed like, okay, there's a moment here where, you know, it seemed like there, as the representative said, there was an opening to dive onto the budget and see where it went. Sure enough, in early June, some version of this did pass out of committee after it was already into the budget, and it went to healthcare financing. But I honestly can't make heads or tails of the notation on the state website about what happened from there. If you look it up, you can kind of see it. It moved somewhere, but I don't really know. At that point, we were into the budget, and it just happened to move fast.
Are there any restrictions on the type of bills that can be added to a budget?
No, though what we heard a lot of, and it makes sense, is that generally the legislature tries to avoid passing policy in the budget, but this is obviously policy to some degree. It's because it added the funding to it. I think without the funding, that would have been a real hard sell.
So like, I'm wondering if the Records Act, would the Records Act has any funding aspect to it, or would that be a stretch?
The records one has been a hard sell for an interesting reason. It saves money. It saves a lot of money because it really is expensive for the state to redact all these things and say no all the time. But while that's a great argument to have, it doesn't necessarily make it a perfect fit into everything all the time. So we did try that with the budget, and we were told, no, that's not really the spot for this. The budget is about how we spend the money, how we save it goes to a separate set of things. And that makes sense to me. So
Thanks.
Other questions from folks? Could be anything about any of it.
Yeah, I'm a Waltham resident, and I know this week they announced some plans for a large section of the Fernald to become parks. They have a small memorialization section, but seeing now that the State House is creating this commission, which explicitly, one of the goals is to create guidelines around, how to properly memorialize and sort of search for unmarked graves. How do you see the work being done, from the city side, with also these new eventually requirements coming from the commission?
It's a terrific question. I thought a lot about the city plans that were revealed this week. There's a lot in the weeds that we could go down into on that, but I think at the broad level, I think they're still not serious. And I think there's kind of a chasm. Take what was proposed this week for the Fernald, which was a train that will drive people around, a driving range, recreational fields, take your pick, a small memorial, yes. And then they slap the word disability on everything because they know now that there's pressure on that, but it's unclear who they talked to or what they did. Just the divide between the seriousness of our work in getting this legislation passed and the seriousness of a statewide coalition of advocates versus the sort of silliness of that proposal. It says that the city is still not ready to prioritize the central theme of that site being what it is, which is a site, what they call a site of conscience, a place that really needs this as its dominant theme, not as its sub theme to it, where people go to have fun. And I will say that I ask every former resident that I speak with what they think should be done with that site. And they say to a T, they don't want to see all the buildings saved. Many of them would love to see them all blown up, they've said to me, and I understand that. They want a lot of nature there for peace. And they do want it to be a recreation site. They think that children being able to play there is a redemptive thing. So I'm not against the spirit entirely of the plan, but the balance of it, per usual, is way off. The city has still never met with the disability advocates who asked for a meeting at the beginning of that protest. I think it smacks of what has been the problem all along, which is really a lack of seriousness of purpose. And that's disappointing to see. Other questions have been raised in the community about the city's priorities. We're stiffing teachers right now in the union budget, and it does seem unfair to then propose spending millions of dollars on this. Where I can tell you it'll go predictably is that soon they will announce the next phase of what they'll do with the buildings. They will then offer us the museum that we've always asked for, but in a building that is now, as you saw in the photos earlier on, totally destroyed, and for a contract that would put all of the repairs on us. And then they will try to say that we are the ones who are being recalcitrant. And it's just a playbook I've seen for now 20 years of living in this city. And I'm not eager to play with it anymore. So I think, honestly, for my own sanity, what I'm doing in this work is trying to go above it and find the threads that tie our communities together statewide. I do think it's going to need advocates like you in the community to really fight. And I frankly, after the arson threats and the protest and everything, I'm too beat up from dealing with the city to take that on personally anymore. It just killed my health. It was a bad road to go down. So
Understood.
We need you.
Thanks for the perspective.
Sure.
I see Maria has her hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Oh, hi. My name is Henry. I have a question. Why is the city of Waltham not taking it seriously?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I can guess, which is that a lot of the towns where there were these big institutions, a lot of the people in those towns worked in those places. They relied on them for their living. It was an important part of their lives. And now that it's history and that history doesn't look so great, it's really hard for them to come to grips with. And so I think they're doing what is a very common human thing, which is they just want to move on. They don't want to have to deal with it. And I think what a lot of us are saying is moving on is a lot trickier than just deciding you want to move on. Like you ignore a lot of people when you do that wrong. But I think they just want to move on. And I think they want to be done with it.
It will cause a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, Henry was saying that to have that to be like something of an amusement park or some type of thing, it would be very disrespectful.
Exactly.
I
It'll
agree.
put a hamper into our community.
Yeah.
And you know how circuses, treat us, apparently back in
That-
those days.
That's it. That's exactly the connection. Is
You
for
know
me,
the Greatest
Carnival,
Showman?
right? What's that?
Do you know the movie called The Greatest Showman? You know?
That's a good point. Very good point.
Terrific.
Exactly. If they built a circus over there, they'll it'll give us the middle finger to
Yes.
us.
Look, Henry, you're the first person to bring that. I teach that in my class, and you are so right that I always have in my mind when you hold a carnival in these places, we were the freaks in the cages that they
Exactly.
used to out, and this is really insulting for that reason.
I felt insulted.
That's very good
That City of
point.
Walton will put a circus in the respective place.
Yep, it's almost like it's a park.
It's an
but
outrage. I'm sorry for stirring. I'm angry,
I'm with you. I hear you.
and that should not be tolerated, whatsoever.
It's why we need folks like you to speak up and be part of this conversation, because then I think they wouldn't get so far in these plans before hearing from people that, hey, this isn't a good idea to do. So I agree entirely. Other questions from folks? Anybody else have
go.
questions? You can reach out to me anytime. I put my email in the chat. I will try to get back to you. I've decided to do the very silly undertaking for the next year of writing a biography of Walter Fernald, since we have this large institution and no one knows actually who the person was behind it. So bear with me as I move slowly with email lately. But I am happy to offer thoughts or advice and to welcome all of you both into the push for the records bill. And also in the work ahead of envisioning what this commission can be. I think we can do something different and something really special. And I think we have a lot of people who would want to do that. And we have some really amazing disabled folks who've done some of this work in the past and can guide us. And I'm excited for that and eager for it. So.
Thank you so much, Alex, for being here and for that incredible summary, and Rep. Garbely too. I think we really just have to take a moment here and celebrate the progress. And we have some work ahead to make sure we get the most we can get out of this commission, and part of that is pushing forward on the records bill as well. But we have a great community, passionate and powerful, and I personally look forward to this work. This affects my family and me personally. So thank you, everybody. Feel free to reach out and have a good rest of the summer. See you soon.
You too. Bye.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Rep. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Alice Allen, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Will you make it to your next event?
Yeah, I'm gonna go hop in the car, shuffle across town. Alan, how's your new house? Ever so briefly. Good. Good. Give my love to Susan. And I'll talk to you soon. All right, man. Maura, thank you so much.
Thanks again. All
Do
right.
you want to bring
Take
me that
care.
recording too? And I will
Yeah.
send it to Adam down at Duke. Okay.
I'll send it along.
Thank you so much.
All
See you
right.
later.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.